going to waste your time with introductions and all sorts of other things. We're going to head straight into in this case, the Middle East and representations of anti-Semitism in Arab media and among Arab Muslim intellectuals. So we have two papers, one by Esther Webman and the other by Rami Aziz. They will go in sequence, and then we'll have questions and answers.
Good morning. The Palestinian cause is not about land and soil, but it is about faith and belief, insist Islamists in their attempts to Islamize the Arab-Israeli conflict. Furthermore, there is a continuous attempt to Islamize anti-Semitism already identified in the mid-1960s by political scientist Yoshafat Arkabi in his pioneering work on Arab attitudes on Israel. The Islamization of the conflict entails several consequences. A certain conceptualization of the conflict causes and sources through religious Islamic lenses, a perception of the desirable solution, and the provision of the motivation and justification for a specific mode of conduct in order to achieve that goal. Whereas the Islamization of anti-Semitism entails the reconstruction of the image of the Jews by using the past to construct the present and translate resentment towards the Jews in Islamic scriptures into an emotional and intellectual Judeophobia to encourage religious and political activism. In my lecture this morning, I would like to share with you some ideas on the role of religion in the conflict over Palestine and on its impact on the Arab anti-Semitic discourse. This is part of an ongoing project exploring references to the Jews in Arab and particularly Palestinian and Egyptian Islamist as well as nationalist press during major landmarks in the conflict's history, from the Arab Wailing Wall riots in 1929 to President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel in 2017. This is a qualitative research which seeks to establish how Islam was used to Islamize the conflict and anti-Semitism, and to assess when the Islamization attempts started and did they succeed, and to what extent the anti-Semitic manifestations derived from classic Islam. A basic premise of this research is that anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world is a religious, cultural, social, and political construction of the contemporary era in the wake of the conflict and the rise of Arab nationalism and Islamism. Religious anti-Judaic and Judeophobic themes, as well as imported Christian European anti-Semitic themes, combine to create a new, authentic brand of anti-Semitism that can be termed Islamic new anti-Semitism. It is both a continuation of the past and a modern phenomenon. Hence, I suggest referring to the religiously based denigration of Judaism, defamation of the Jewish character, and efforts at the destruction of the Jews as Judeophobia, and to designate the term anti-Semitism to the imported Western themes such as the perception of the Jews as an omnipotent subversive power seeking to control the world, which is absent in Islamic culture, which perceives the Jews as meek and coward. Such a differentiation refines the understanding of the phenomenon and avoids the pitfall of essentialism in the search for the roots of anti-Semitism in the Arab world, common in certain works that claims that it is an inherent part of the Islamic culture. This approach also corresponds with the schema of paradigms introduced by Douglas Pratt to reflect the historical variants and developments of the relationship between Islam and Judaism. He suggests four paradigms: the originating paradigms of the early Islamic era, the historic legal paradigms of the Zimmi regulations of the medieval period, the contemporary negative paradigms or the Islamic neo-antisemitism of the modern era, and the prospective positive paradigms based on acceptance and affirmation, which can be traced in recent years. Most writers on the conflict acknowledge the role of religion, but they considered it secondary to the role of the secular nationalist discourse until the 1967 war, claiming that the conflict underwent an Islamization process with the surge of political Islam in the aftermath of that war. I contend that Islam played a crucial role in the conflict since its very early stages for the mobilization of domestic, pan-Arab, and pan-Islamic support for the Palestinian cause. And it was naturally so. Islam was the major term of reference. As Jonathan Gribetz showed in his study on Muslim-Jewish relations in the late years of the Ottoman Empire, the intellectuals of this period often thought of one another and interpreted one another's actions in terms of two central categories: religion and race. Religion was central to the empire relationship with its diverse populations and continued to be central during the Mandate period. No other ideological idiom would have been familiar or comprehensible to the rural inhabitants of the country who constituted a majority and to whom the idea of nation and national interest was totally alien, elaborated Palestinian scholar Musa Budairi. Moreover, Islam perceives itself as faith, deen, and polity or state, dawla, and even the modern concept of Arab nationalism or any other nationalism in the Middle East was imbued with religion. The rise of Islamist movements only exacerbated the attempts to Islamize the conflict and reinforced themes which have already existed. The entanglement of religion in the conflict had a decisive impact on the rise of anti-Semitism in Arab and Muslim societies and on its features. But since the Islamization of the conflict was seen as derived from the surge of Islamist movements, it had also been assumed that the state-sponsored anti-Semitism of the 1950s and 1960s was inculcated from above, whereas Islamist anti-Semitism emerged from below, and as such it appears to be more deeply rooted. But it seems that Islamist anti-Semitism was also inculcated from above, with the efforts of the Palestinian leadership to construct the conflict as a religious conflict. Both nationalist and Islamist discourse on the Jews drew anti-Jewish themes from Islamic sources, albeit from different standpoints and different degrees, to describe the Jewish threat. Islamist ideology combined the historical religious aspect of its perception of the conflict with national and social aspects, and combined in its Judeophobic discourse imported Western themes. I will briefly refer to two events to highlight the mobilization methods. The Second Intifada, known also as Al-Aqsa Intifada, which broke out at the end of September 2000 after the visit of Ariel Sharon to the Temple Mount, or Al-Haram al-Sharif, and the other event, the 1929 riots, which broke out in the same area at the Wailing Wall. The Intifada marked a watershed because it triggered an unprecedented wave of incitement and anti-Semitic manifestations in the Arab world and worldwide, including among Muslim communities in the West. It also was a watershed in the discussion of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. It was no surprise that a symbol such as the sacred Islamic site of Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem had the capacity to spark off such an aggressive Muslim reaction. Besides the popular demonstrations and the violence, Friday sermons at mosques throughout the Arab world were dominated by angry denunciation of Israeli brutality and calls for jihad, holy war, which was presented as a religious duty incumbent on each and every Muslim. Jihad is now a duty for the entire Ummah until Palestine and Al-Aqsa Mosque are liberated and Jews are either pushed into their graves or back where they came from, said in an interview to CNN Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman, the spiritual leader of Egyptian Islamic militant group Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, imprisoned in the US for his involvement in the bombing of the New York Trade Center in 1993. Hamas leaders described Jews as enemies of humanity and monsters in the shape of human beings, and reiterated that Israel is a foreign body imposed by force and will be eliminated by force. But the calls to action remained unheeded. The public anger in Arab countries was vented in demonstrations and a barrage of articles, caricatures, and TV programs invoking mainly the blood libel, Nazi-era terminology and symbols, Holocaust denial, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. References to the Islamic scriptures were more confined to Islamist media outlets and websites. Similar patterns of mobilization could be traced already in the first violent confrontations between Arabs and Jews in the 1920s. From 1918 onwards, the leadership of the Palestinian nationalist movement drew on Islamic arguments and sentiment in mobilizing popular support in the struggle against the Jewish national home and the British Mandate. The Grand Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini and the Supreme Muslim Council consistently highlighted the Islamic importance of Jerusalem and the threat posed by Zionism to the Muslim holy sites there, particularly after the Wailing Wall disturbances of 1929. The Wailing Wall crisis, considered by Israeli historian Hillel Cohen as the year zero of the Jewish-Arab conflict, is indeed the first most important case of the use of Islam by the Palestinian leadership at the time. It started on the Day of Atonement and involved incitement, violence, rumors on the danger to Al-Aqsa, and of course there were some anti-Semitic manifestations, but they were still marginal at the time. What were the methods of actions utilized? One, organizing demonstrations, processions, and riots, especially on the occasion of religious festivities and in location with religious significance. Another form is issuing fatwas or religious edicts banning the sale of lands to Jews, forbidding concession of any part of Palestine, or later on justifying suicide attacks against Israeli targets. Another mean, calling for jihad and glorifying martyrdom, and convening conferences for the mobilization of the Muslim world, and constructing the myth of Palestine as a sacred Muslim land, and highlighting the importance of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque in Islam. This is not for granted. Spreading rumors and incitement by political and religious leaders. The other side of the coin of mobilization was the attempt of justification of the conflict in national and religious terms, aiming basically at undermining the Zionist claims over Palestine. Historians, religious scholars, preachers, and journalists became obsessively preoccupied with Jewish history and its links to Palestine, the roots of contemporary Jews in their relation to the children of Israel, the alleged misconceptions and falsification of the Torah by the Jews, the encounter between Muslims and Jews in the early days of Islam according to the Quran and Islamic tradition, the age-old hostility towards Islam, the Jewish hostility towards Islam and Muslims, and the Torah and the Talmud as the sources of Jewish mentality, and last but not least, the Jews' inherent traits and evil traits and behavior. They developed a new kind of polemics, which could be found in scholarly works as well as in newspapers, television channels, and other media outlets, and differed from the traditional Islamic polemics. And I will just point out few differences. It is a one-sided polemic. The author presents his arguments, but those do not receive any serious response, and they are not debated. In the past, there was a kind of dialogue between theologians. It is found in the popular print media, whereas in the past it was a formal genre written in the form of chapters of books against various religions. It is conducted by politicians, publicists, and representatives of Islamic movements, whereas in the past the debaters were primarily members of the religious establishment as well as philosophers and intellectuals. The modern polemic is not exclusively religious, but includes anti-Semitic themes adopted from Western classical and racist vocabulary. And last, modern religious polemics generally serves political purposes and uses holy Muslim scriptures to negate the other rather than proving the superiority of the Islamic religion. Moreover, it seems that the modern polemics does not shy from inventing tradition and defying Islamic scriptures. The designation of Palestine as a religious endowment, waqf, is a modern invention aimed at preventing any concession of any part of the land in any future agreement with Israel. Similarly, jihad was traditionally perceived as an obligation upon Muslims in general, from which the majority are relieved, as a matter of fact. But jihad in Palestine turned into a personal duty incumbent on every Muslim. The denial of Jewish roots in Palestine also contradicts Islamic scriptures. The renowned Muslim modernist Rashid Rida opposed Zionism because it threatened to dislodge Muslims and Christians from Palestine and to replace the Al-Aqsa Mosque with a new Jewish temple. He developed a strong animosity or antipathy towards Zionism, which verged on anti-Semitism, but he could not dismiss revelation and deny the Jewish ties to Jerusalem and Palestine. This has changed since the establishment of the State of Israel. To conclude, there is a striking continuity in the patterns of Islamic mobilization, the terms, the symbols, and the days of action, and in the discourse. Just before finalizing my lecture, another crisis developed in the area of the Temple Mount. A new mosque was opened for prayer in the Bab el-Rahma, or the Gate of Mercy building, in defiance of the delicate status quo, leading to clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian leaders and activists, and threatening to fuel yet another bloody confrontation. The Waqf leadership of the Haram al-Sharif issued calls to Palestinians to attend the Friday prayers en masse, ignoring Israeli warnings. Concomitantly, in an effort to thwart the prospective American peace plan, the deal of the century, a group of Palestinian Islamic scholars issued a fatwa on March 3rd, warning against any form of normalization with the Zionist entity. Normalizations and reconciliation means empowerment of Jews over the land of the Muslims, surrender to the infidel, and loss of religion and Islamic lands, they warned, adding that reconciliation and normalization with the Jews contradicts the Quran.
Exactly.
However, preliminary findings clearly show that despite the continuous exploitation of Islam in the incitement against Israel, Zionism, and the Jews, the most popular recurring anti-Semitic themes were derived from classical Christian and Western vocabulary. A recent research on radical Islam held in the framework of a project on religious actors in conflict areas examined the British Muslim Brotherhood to establish to what extent radical Islam's animosity to Israel derived from classic Islam, an indigenous component, and what had been the role of other modern and classic and exogenous components. Using the method of computerized text mining to survey 20,000 articles in the Muslim Brotherhood website ikhwanweb.com, the study discovered that Jews and Israel had been first and foremost associated with the Arab-Israeli conflict, 42% of the occurrences, followed by modern European antisemitism, 33%, and classical Islam comes only in the third place, less than 25%. An indigenous factor, namely the classic heritage, contributes less than European anti-Semitism, and that is in a fundamentalist movement discourse. These findings suggest that there is a wide gap, perhaps unconscious, between ideology and practice, and correlate with my conclusion that the most common anti-Semitic themes, even among Islamists, are not necessarily those based on Islamic sources. Another study which supports this claim is the comparative study on the role of religion in interstate or inter-ethnic conflicts by Hillel Frisch and Shmuel Sandler. They argue that however infused they are, the conflicts, with religious substance, they remain essentially national or state-centered. They claim that while religion expresses prominent primordial values, the points of contention continue to be territorially centered, and the dominant discourse, especially in the international arena, is usually more nationalist or statist than religious and theocratic. Why? Leading scholar of the history of the Jews in the Middle East, and in the Middle Ages, as a matter of fact, Mark Cohen, explained the extensive usage of the protocols in the Arab anti-Semitic discourse in the scarcity of Islamic texts conveying such a devilish image of the Jews. I would add that the Christian and Western anti-Semitic themes drew their prominence in Arab discourse due to their universality, pervasiveness, and persistence. In the wake of the Arab revolutions of 2011, the growing aversion in Arab societies from the Islamist ideology and practice, and the regional and global strategic changes, there is a growing trend, albeit slow, of revisiting the attitudes towards Israel and the Jews. And we should recognize that. And last but not least, I hope that further study of this still under-researched topic would enable us to better understand the anti-Semitic phenomenon in Arab and Muslim, the anti-Semitic phenomenon in Arab and Muslim societies, and perhaps encourage the use of religion for positive goals. Thank you.